it's easy to sculpt in the system a particular scene I have, and that's so much fun. And
Yeah,
I'll literally
awesome.
role play that or in my head, and I will make little sounds like I'll run around like, and that's how I build. That's how I build the scenarios. I imagine a thing. I have my miniatures. I move them around, and
Love
then
it.
figure out how to model that.
Welcome to Cardboard Creations, where we discuss the process, techniques, and inspiration for designing board games. I'm your host, Candice Harris, and I am super duper excited to be here today with Gordon Calleja to find out how Fateforge Chronicles of Kaan was created. But first, let's jump into a brief overview of how it works. Fateforge Chronicles of Kaan is an action-adventure cooperative campaign game for 1 to 4 players, which delivers an accessible RPG-like board game experience guided by an app that remembers and reacts to your choices. Each player represents a unique hero playing through a campaign full of surprising twists, meaningful narrative choices, and action-packed combat scenes, which are the heart of the game. The length of each game session is flexible. You can comfortably play through a combat and several story scenes in 1 hour, or spend the whole evening with your friends immersed in a thrilling adventure. The story adapts to the outcome of each combat, leading you down different paths of its sprawling branches, offering a unique experience with each playthrough. Hey Gordon, welcome to the show.
Hey, Candice, happy to be here.
I'm so glad to have you here. Fateforge Chronicles of Kaan seems like such a big and ambitious design effort. And I mean, you have this like epic kind of cooperative campaign game that's like action adventure, which already seems like it's like a monster to design. But then it's really well integrated with an app that, drives the narrative. It also helps with the world exploration. And then it makes battles so smooth to set up and play through and fun, and then there's a soundtrack too. So I gotta know, what initially inspired you to create Fateforge?
Two main threads. The big drive for it was that I'm a lifelong player of fantasy RPGs. Well, not lifelong because I haven't done that for a while. But I grew up playing RPGs. My father ran an 18-year-old campaign every Saturday.
Cool.
So I played, throughout my childhood and teenage years and early 20s. And of course, once I got into board games, I sought that experience from board games, which was fine when I had a lot of time. But now I mostly play board games during the week after work, dinner, and so on. And I've been finding it harder and harder to fit in campaign games that take those like 3 hours, including setup, right, or longer. And also to play these games with partners, and the last few partners I had wanted to play these games, and we could never really play them because they're either too convoluted or require too much admin, or they're just simply too long or too heavy for an evening, at least to keep them up over a campaign length. So I wanted to make something that is easy to set up and that gives you that same kind of story and imagined world feel and a tactical combat, but within an hour space minimum. And if I do splash out on 3-4 hours, I really wanted there to be more happening in terms of combat, like what the kind of action sequences that are happening in the combat.
Gotcha.
And more happening in the story, more story beats in 3 hours than what's essentially a skirmish and a bit of story on either side of that, which is what a lot of dungeon crawlers are. I do love my skirmish games, my tabletop skirmish games, but then I want to be even more tactical and I'm going into more detail. So for me, dungeon crawlers often fit into an uncomfortable middle ground between these two. And so that was the main motivator, I'd say. And I think that first the internal very bad name for the game was Fast Forward Dungeon. I was just looking. I forgot about that. I was looking through my design diaries, and that's the title of the book.
Fast
It's
forward
Fast Forward
dungeon.
Dungeon Design Goals.
I mean,
That's how it all
that's what you were trying to do.
started. And this was all before the game was set in Studio Agat's world, because so that took it in a different direction. So this is, I
Oh,
guess, where it started from, and the second part of it has to do with I'm a game academic, so that means that I write and develop theory, frameworks, and so on for video games and board games. And narrative has been one of the things that I really focus on. I mainly focus on immersion and presence and narrative. And I've created a number of frameworks and then used board games initially to as kind of illustrations of those theories, and ways to experiment with them that didn't cost as much as video games to make. And so I've done most of the narrative games have looked into emergent narrative, so more sandboxy kind of games, where the
sure,
story
sure.
emerges from gameplay, like Posthuman, Vengeance, and so on. And here I wanted to really lean heavily into the scripted narrative and the story, and do that with a lot of memory, where have the game remember, like a game master does, what you've done. So
Oh,
those are the
cool.
two sort of pillars that came at different times. It started off with the first, and then when Studio Agat and their world got involved, I pushed more on the second. But I do have to give credit to Rado, to Richard Ham. We were having a conversation about Vengeance after it got published, and he said, like, can you please make Vengeance but with a fantasy setting so I can play it with Jen, because she really likes the system, really likes the game, but she won't play something as dark and gritty.
Yeah,
And I think a lot of people are going to be put off by the theme
right.
when the gameplay is really something unique. And so,
Mm.
do, and every so often be like, are you working on the fantasy Vengeance? So it was fantasy Vengeance for a while. So
Wow,
thanks,
that's cool.
Richard, for nudging me in this direction.
That's cool. So, can you talk about the world a bit? Like you were saying, like where did the world come from?
So the world came from a happy, very late night random meeting at a traffic light in Indianapolis with a lovely Frenchman called Nel, who's
Uh-huh.
the founder of Studio Agat, which is a French RPG studio, and they do beautiful worlds, very deep, and yes, I think more contemporary worlds and
Okay.
more contemporary takes on the fantasy genre, more nuanced. They have a very nuanced take on what's good and evil, how different races exist. Everything's more well rounded. But I met Nell at a traffic light. We started chatting. We couldn't stop chatting. We saw eye to eye on so many things, and it's been such a inspiring back and forth over the years. And at some point, Nell said, "Look, we have this world. It's our baby. It's our biggest project ever, Fateforge, and I'd really be honored if you would, make a game in that world, because I don't want we don't want to trust anyone that doesn't share our values and vision for what these things are."
Wow, wow.
And so I was really honored, because I'd been following this world and its Kickstarters, and aside from being absolutely beautiful, it's incredibly deep. This team has
Wow.
spent years developing the languages in this world, the social movements, how different societies interact with each other. It's just a beautiful thing. And yeah, that's where the world came from, essentially, the minds of the people at Studio Agat.
Gotcha, gotcha. Oh, that's really cool to hear. So, when and how did you, like, after you had your initial idea, and I don't even know, like, the timing of when the story came in and the app came in, but when did you, like, start making, like, your first playable prototype?
There are two phases to Fateforge. Initially, the game was, well, when I have to consult my little diary here. So initially, the game was a one versus many,
Okay.
which had like a branching structure of combats and very simple framing narratives. where the heroes are trying to get to a particular point. They fight a particular boss at the end of each act, and after 3 acts, they fight the actual player, the big bad.
Oh, the
And the big
oh,
bad
cool, cool.
basically buys and recruits minions and deploys them on these maps. So the
Oh,
maps are set, but the enemies are placed by the player, the
oh,
one,
neat.
and they are trying to prevent the players from getting to them that are hidden in the
Gotcha.
tower or dungeon or whatever. And then the final fight is with that player. So they are leveling themselves up, they're leveling their minions up, creating spells, improving their bosses. But that was changed at some point. I did a bit of research. A lot had to do with listening to So Very Wrong talk about the issues with one versus many games, and I switched it to co-op just when I started this collaboration with Studio Agat. So it went from a very combat only one versus many game over a number of sessions to a story campaign. The prototype for the first came together about a month after I started doodling, because it's based on the vengeance system, so it was quite quick to bring to the table. It was playable. Remember, we went, me, Mark, and Dave, the other directors at Mighty Boards, went on one of our design retreats in a forest in Poland.
Oh,
Um, uh,
wow.
and I rolled it out there, and it worked straight away. It was an enjoyable prototype. This one versus many thing was an enjoyable thing straight away, and it was a very, 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 very basic. A character is just some numbers on a poker card, and as soon as that worked, I made a bit of a slightly better prototype with some basic graphic design straight after. So I've been working on Fateforge since now 2019.
Okay, okay. And so, Gordon, I guess that's so cool. Like, again, this is such a big game. But at what point did you then say, "Hey, we're going to have an app for this game?" And was that in your head from the beginning that you might want to do something like that, or when did that come? And can you touch on how, like, the timing of when that came into play with your design and development, and like, how did that go? Like, who developed that?
Okay, so that was a very big decision, and that came along with the switch from one versus many to co-op.
Okay.
When we shifted to co-op, I felt like, okay, I want to try and retain some of the functions that the player was doing.
Yeah, gotcha.
And once narrative was introduced, I'm like, okay, this is I need to have an app, because I had been researching hybrid board games for a while, like about 8 years. At first in Copenhagen, at the center that I ran there, did a big bit of research on hybrid board games and how people engage with them, what they like, not like about them. And then we started a big research project on narrative games here at the University of Malta, where a number of PhD researchers and lecturers, including the writer for Fateforge, Daniel Vella, looking at what's the state of narrative in board games. And we played about 75 board narrative games, and sort of
Wow.
analyzed them, taxonomized them, applied my frameworks to them. And of course, some
Wow.
of these had apps. And one of
Yeah,
the
yeah.
things which became really clear is that the apps are doing very, very little.
Mm.
There's this, I think, trust to please or appease, sorry, players who don't want to have a printed version of an app, right? A book that does what the app does, and that for
Right.
me is utterly pointless, in the
Mm.
sense that I want to work in a medium because it has certain affordances, certain characteristics that allow me to do things that I could not do in any other medium. Otherwise, what's the point? And so
Gotcha.
I went in the other direction. I wanted to use the app to do stuff that a game master does, right, or a video game does, and that a printed thing cannot do. So that's where
Mm.
it came in. So I told Dave and Mark, like, yeah, I will do a co-op version of it. I will include the narrative, but then we'll put the app so that we can supercharge the narrative with a lot of memory functions. So,
Yeah.
and it allowed me to do something that's really important for this design, to bridge the choices and the actions that you do in combat with narrative and the other way around. So certain things that you do in Fateforge in the combat have an impact on the narrative. Even things like certain stuff that you find in some chests or certain people that you defeat in the combat, without the app telling you such, will have an effect, big or small, later on in the
Mm.
narrative. Where usually these
That's
things
so
are a bit
cool.
separate, like right, things that you do in combat stay sort of in combat, and you do narrative choices that have narrative outcomes. Here,
Right.
those two bridge into each other quite a bit, and that was for me really important to remove the separation between story happening in the story bit and story happening in the narrative bit. I wanted emergent narrative to happen in the
Yeah.
combat bit, so even the combat is very story like in the
Right,
actions that
right.
you do and what happens, and the narrative, the app narrative, to be more of the scripted one, where it branches, where we've thought of all the things that could happen and have presented a written thing for you. So yeah, long answer, but
That's
that's where the app came
wow.
in. It was a risky decision. We knew some players would bounce off it, and we definitely got quite a lot of pushback during the Kickstarter, where people are like, "Oh, I don't want to play a game with an app," and I understand that.
Mm. Right.
But I think ultimately part of that is comes from a lot of other board games apps, especially narrative ones, haven't really utilized apps as strongly. I mean, Legends of Galzir does it quite nicely now, but there's a lot that you can do with an app that
Yeah.
makes it streamlined and also make the world feel more alive, that I wanted to at least start exploring.
Yeah, yeah. So did you like how did you design how the app works, without revealing your magic tricks or but I'm very curious like did you kind of direct that? Did you code it? Like what?
Yeah, I did not code it. We so Mighty Boards was initially a video game studio, Mighty Box. Um,
Oh, never knew that.
and the first Posthuman came out of Mighty Box, actually, not Mighty Boards. Then some of us shifted to Mighty Boards, and now Mighty Box is folding under Mighty Boards as Mighty Boards Digital.
Oh, wow.
And we all have, I mean, David Kirkhope used to work on Cyberpunk and Thronebreaker, so he has a big video game background. I worked on video games as well, and so we had a lot of this sort of video game knowledge and talent, and thus we decided to open Mighty Boards Digital to make some ports of board games. Oops, maybe
Cool.
that's a reveal, but yeah, there you go. um, and
Ooh.
Fateforge was going to be our first companion app, to show like what you can do with companion apps that isn't being done essentially.
Yeah.
So we hired a coder. I designed the interaction design, how it would all function, what the screens would look like, and of course the system part I designed alongside the board game. But there was quite a delay with having a working version of the app, a basic version of the app,
Oh,
to
yeah.
me actually developing the game, which was quite a challenge. So
Yeah.
yeah. I designed it along with the board game myself, and the rest was done in house. One of the developers, Christian Paller, took over translating what we're doing in the board game to the app and worked with the coder to implement that.
Wow.
That was done in house. The coder knows the game inside out. He plays the game well, so that's why I think it feels quite organic and well fitting, because it's all done in
Yeah.
house and we're iterating on it constantly.
Awesome. Awesome. That's so cool. So, I guess like what was your playtesting process like? Knowing that you didn't have the app initially, so feel free to touch on what it was like playtesting before the app and then after you had the app.
Painful. The playtesting process was painful.
Oh, I
so
believe it.
so one, I won't say mistake. It's our first campaign game, my first campaign game, my first co-op game,
Oh, wow.
and we took a windy way to get where we got.
Yeah.
Um, and one of the issues are two main challenges here.
Uh-huh.
One was the fact that we're working on the combat and the combat scenes different sequences thereof, started setting up the branches and the different paths they could take, but in combat. And thus we didn't have a holistic view of what the game would be until just before the Kickstarter launched.
Wow.
So when previewers had a look at it, they were looking at pretty much what we were looking at in terms of the story part and so on. And that's why a lot of things were not, a lot of aspects of the game were not even there. And that
Gotcha.
was a very, very basic alpha. So one part was trying to imagine what the rest of it would be like outside of the combats. And I had the
Yeah.
text to some degree, but
Yeah.
not how it would feel, and how these things feel is very important for immersion to get you into the world. So that's
Right.
one big challenge. And testers were not testing that. They were just testing combats for the longest time.
Wow.
Like,
Wow.
because testers would need not just the app, but like a good version of the app with decent UX, which came very late.
Gotcha.
And
Gotcha.
the other part was running the combat part of the app, which does a couple of fairly complex operations, and some, don't want to spoil too much, but there are many
Yeah.
scenarios where combat scenes where things change in the map, sometimes
Mm.
radically. And so we had to have a test lead or a developer, well, most developers, be the app, essentially. And we would roll dice behind the screen. We had a system.
Oh, wow.
I made a manual system to replicate what would happen in the app.
Oh, wow.
I mean, that's what the
Wow.
app is actually doing. I mean, the app is basically rolling numbers on dice on charts, because that's how
Right.
I know
Right.
how to do it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so you're rolling. It's that okay. The bowman is gonna do a reaction, and it will be this.
This. Oh, gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. Like for a way to kind of simulate that before the app is ready. Yeah. And I guess even at more of a high level, like how do you usually run playtesting? Like, do you test games on your own for a bit and then roll it out to the Mighty Boards team, or do you have groups that you send it out to? Like, how do you usually run playtesting?
It depends on the weight of the game,
Okay.
and it's a process which is constantly evolving. And it took a big turn, I guess, after I finished Unboxed. I did 5 years of research for a book about board game design and analysis called
Yeah.
Unboxed. And
Yeah.
a big chunk of those, I did interviews with 35 designers, and we went quite deep into their processes, and one of them was testing. So, of course, I learned a lot of stuff from there, integrated into our own process. In general, if I had to break it down, let's say for a mid-weightish kind of game, we're looking at, I'll test the game on my own first, the initial prototype. I'll play test it with our developers and other designers, and see if there's something there. There's something interesting
Yeah.
in the idea or the system, or it could be just one mechanic. We'll figure out what's interesting, or if it's worth working on, pick that, and then evolve that. We keep doing that until there is something that's playable by others, and then we'll involve other people in Mighty Boards. And then it broadens out to our test groups locally, still at a sort of basic level,
Cool.
while saving a good amount of test groups from seeing it at a very basic level. So the testing here really depends. If it's a Euro, if it's something like Rebirth, where the visuals make a difference, but not that much, the graphic design might, for clarity, to something like Fateforge or Vengeance, where a big part of the game is you feeling like you are this character in this world, you being immersed. And there,
Right.
you're not testing just the mechanics, but the feel. And so you do need to do some sort of mock-up of what the game will feel like, in which case it's, I'll do images I find from other things for internal use, and some basic sort of graphic design layout. In those cases, we hold back on rolling it out to more test groups. And once we decide that the game has a decent prototype with some visuals as well that give you a feel of the game, we not just roll it out to local groups, but we contact groups we have abroad in various countries This
Mm,
started with various universities around the world and other game study scholars that were interested in having their students test it and having them test it.
cool.
And some games have been tested in over 12 universities around the world. Others go to more like 6, where we need more focused testing. So it really depends. But that's generally the process. We send out physical prototypes of the game, not tabletop simulator for the most part, so that we can get to see players playing around the table
Yeah.
to these various test groups. We hire test leads that will run the tests of the game over an extended period, finding different groups and so on. And then we basically run through this process until we have a draft of the actual game. At which point we
Gotcha.
generally get new groups, and we expand the groups, and we expand text testing locally. So it's a
Okay. Okay.
long, involved
Yeah.
process. Fateforge was very different because of the test leads couldn't run this app part of it, so we had to have more limited test groups, and we needed different test groups of different sizes for different player counts, because the game is different at 2, 3, or 4 players. And because it's a campaign game, there's fatigue involved.
Right.
So
Right.
we knew that certain test groups could only do an act or two once, twice, 3 times before they'll get fed up and just stop testing.
Right.
So
Oh, wow.
it was more staggered. We didn't have as many groups at the same time. We sort of, exhausted one batch of groups, and then a few of those groups or a few individuals would want to keep playing and testing, and we'd save them for later runs.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
So yeah, fairly involved.
Yeah. Sounds like it, but that's really cool, especially how you're leveraging universities that have game design courses and students playtesting. That's really cool. So, at what point did you start documenting rules?
I mean, generally, as I'm doodling from very early on in my notebook here, every few pages, when I feel like, okay, this is settled, I've tried it, there's something here, I will start writing. I'll have a page of rules every few pages. When I feel like the thing hangs together, then I immediately get a Word doc out there, and at least for the combat part, I'll start with the turn structure, or the overall game structure, the turn structure, and start filling in, even with bullet points, what those rules are. So rules come in as soon as it goes to any group outside of Mighty Boards,
Yeah,
essentially.
gotcha.
Not that we give them those rules, but where multiple developers or test leads are involved, then we need to have a rule book that everyone is following.
Yeah, yeah, that
So I
makes
would
sense.
say that would be in the case of Fateforge. After a month, I had the basic prototype. Let's say about 6 months after that, we started bringing in other groups. So
Gotcha.
quite early on.
Cool. Cool. And I mean, you touched on some of your challenges with playtesting and just like making things work without having the app immediately ready. But did you have any other like big challenges when you were designing and developing Fateforge that you want to mention?
Yeah. Is this going to be a Netflix series? Because I have a few episodes where. All right, let me start by saying, like, I've written a PhD. I've written 2 academic books for MIT Press, and I've had to do that while also designing games and for a while running Mighty Boards. This was definitely, hands down, the most challenging project I've ever done, even above all of that. It was
Wow.
incredibly difficult.
Mm.
Partly, maybe, I think, we bit off a bit more than we can chew, in the sense of team size. I mean, only a small part of Mighty Boards was working on this, and for a long time I was doing a lot of the game design, the overall story structure, the interaction design in the app, art direction, project management, and it was quite a small team working on a really big game. Well, after I speak to other publishers doing these games, it's like, well, okay, maybe that was a bit challenging. So that was
Mm.
maybe part of it, but there was several things that made this hard. One, as I said, was the lack of an app where that was such an important part of the experience.
Right.
And some of the feedback I got from previewers at the Kickstarter stage was, in fact, that the combat was great, but the rest of it wasn't coming together, and I understood why. Even the Kickstarter didn't communicate what the rest of the experience was going to be, because the app wasn't there yet.
Right.
So that's one of them. Then I think the biggest challenge with designing this game is the fact that it's not scenario based. So most dungeon crawlers, like, you pick a scenario, you do the scenario, and then you reset your health and everything, and then you do another scenario.
Right.
Which means when you're testing or you're developing or balancing, you know the state of the players at the start, which is fresh with this much advancements, or this
Right.
much to this much. Some games, I mean, almost completely codify that advancement, like Oathsworn, where you are, at this, before the scenario, you want to get more skills. So I know as a designer who I am, that's really useful. That's really convenient. Here, I got it into my head that I didn't want that. Not the best of ideas necessarily, but like, I wanted it to feel like an organic thing where the sessions were, the session lengths were decided by you. And the minimum session is whatever. You want to read some narrative and then stop? Fine. Narrative and combat and another bit of narrative, that's an hour. That's the minimum unit. But you want to do 3 hours? Fine, go for it. That fluid structure, and the fact that I wanted it to feel, I was going to say realistic, but that's not the word. I wanted to feel like you are in the fantasy world with as much as possible. As close to a role-playing game or an ongoing video game, which is kind of realistic in the sense that I don't auto-heal. If I've gone to this place and I got really ambitious and I wanted to open all the chests and get all the goodies and kill everyone and also succeed in my mission goals, then there's a good chance I'm going to get really bashed. And that's a bit of a mixed outcome. You managed to do what you wanted to do, but you're also really wounded. And I wanted that to carry over to the next combat, and for you to feel the impact of your choices. This is mainly it. I wanted, for choices in games to have impact, they have to have repercussions.
Yeah.
Repercussions that go beyond the individual combat. Like, all right, we managed this, but we're all almost dead. Yay, we won. Well, no, you just almost got killed. That's not a good thing.
Right.
That was a core part of the design, and also it's part of the vengeance combat system. It works as well if I just reset their health, but I really wanted players to care about every step that they make. So yes, you have only 3, 4, or 5 rounds, but every action, every dice you play can put you in a position which is going to get half of your health knocked down in one round. And that's going to carry over to the next combat, which might be a boss fight, and then good luck with that.
Yeah.
That's a particular design philosophy, and one that I don't find in a lot of other games, which I miss personally. I want to care about not just winning, but I want to care about how I got there and what happened. That meant, though, that it was really difficult to balance, because you might have... Sorry, so it's worth mentioning here for people who haven't played the game that you can heal your damage, but only in a rest scene, which is every 2 or 3 combat scenes. But also you have to pay to heal, which means that that's the same money, the same gold that you're going to use if you want to improve your character, if you want to upgrade, get skills, get items. And also it's the gold that you're going to get from the combat scene itself, which you have to actually go and risk clearing rooms to get. So there's this difficult choice during combat that is related directly with your advancement. And that to me is exciting.
Yeah.
But difficult, because I don't know.
To design. Yeah.
Because I don't know where the party is going to be at any point in the game. And of course, this was okay for the first half of the game, kind of. But once you get to the end of the second act or third act, groups would be in very different places. That
balancing
was
all
very,
that. Wow.
very tough. And then doing the same thing, but for different player counts.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I'm
The
stressed just
other
hearing it.
challenge, the other challenge compounds all this, which is the branching in the game. It's just very difficult to keep in mind. So there's various points. There's small branches which wrap back to the main story, but then there's bigger branches that take you on completely different threads, and this happens more than once in the game. So you might take a choice at a certain point, not very long in the game, which is going to have you on a particular thread and block out other parts. On top of that, there's certain characters that you might annoy, or they might really like you, or you might kill off for various reasons. Again, I don't want to say too much. Simply might not be there, and those combine. So you might be on a particular branch, but not with a certain character. So certain things will not happen, or that character will not tell you things that will be helpful later on, or might not deceive you later on because you killed them off.
Right.
This means that just the tree in itself is difficult to keep in mind with all these variables, but also the combats that you might go down,
Right.
down the path of are also complicated. Plus, I don't know where exactly the party is at that point, development-wise. That was
Yeah. I'm telling you, I'm feeling stressed just like thinking about all these things interwoven together. That sounds like a lot to balance. Wow. That's why it seems it's so ambitious, but I'm glad it exists and, you guys made it, So besides like kind of overcoming some of those challenges, did you have any significant aha moments when you were designing and developing Fateforge?
Yeah, I mean, I said it's the most challenging project, but it's definitely the one I'm most proud of. No offense to my academic books, and also the game I'm most proud of. No offense to the other games. Sorry, games, I love you all, but not really. Because it just came together. I mean, the Vengeance Combat system came together super quickly. Again, on a solo design retreat over the course of a couple of hours. And yeah, good ideas kind of show themselves for what they are quite quickly. And this was an iteration of that. And it really helps having iterated on it over and over and seen mistakes and, and
Yeah.
that system just works well in co-op. So the aha moment, the first basic one is, wow, this works so well in co-op. In Vengeance, even though
That's
it's a
cool.
competitive game, people are helping each other, or at least making snide comments about like, oh, you could do it much better than that with the dice roll. So turning that into a collaborative thing seemed a natural thing to do.
Cool.
And then the other aha moments where I'll try to hop through a couple. I think the first one came from the first time we played that one versus many game in Poland, where it just worked so well with different dice, using different dice for different stats, and with that co-op feel. Oh my god! And the game always had die results behind screens, so that you couldn't see each other's die results, and you had to
Yeah.
discuss narratively. I can take this guy out and steal that gem, or come help you over there, rather than, deal 4 damage here.
Right.
So that was the first small aha moment. And then one of the thing I love most about this game, and people at Mighty Boards will attest to this, and as they laugh at me so much for doing it, I love creating combat scenes for this game. It's really fun. One, the puzzle is really fun for me to play over and over and over with different characters, skills, and so on, because it varies. But more than anything, I don't know. This is how I see it in my head. I can imagine a fantasy scene, any fantasy scene, with any enemies, and with very, very few rules. They're just abilities on the cards of the enemies, and maybe a special rule or two for that combat scene. I can model it without much rule changes, and quite comfortably, in a way that it really is a vivid image in my mind. So I don't just think mechanically, or as I do with other games, oh, I have to do more content, but I literally imagine a thing and then start laying like a piece of the map, some enemies that might not even exist, with some abilities. Like, how would skeletons behave? Well, they're slow, but they keep coming after you, and they come at you from all over the place, and they come back. So they're weak, but they crowd you slowly, and you have the sense of oppression.
Yeah.
And as soon as the first time I did the first faction I did was undead. After I did the basic sort of militia faction, which is
Okay.
sort of the bog standard one. And again, within half an hour, this thing felt like an undead combat so much,
That's so
right? Not
cool.
just in the way the enemies died, but in the way they behave. The AI is very easy to alter, and I have AI on the cards that the enemies always do at the end of the round,
Right.
and then the hidden stuff, the reactions in the app, which are different from that AI. So I have two places where to make these things feel like stuff, and then because the game is on zones, not on hexes or squares, because
Yeah.
it's a bit more abstracted, it's much easier to have like a little ability of that zone. And again, so what I'm trying to get at is that it's easy to sculpt in the system a particular scene I have, and that's so much fun. And
Yeah.
I'll literally
Awesome.
role play that or in my head, and I will make little sounds like I'll run around like and that's how I build. That's how I build the scenarios. I imagine a thing. I have my miniatures. I move them around, and
Love
then
it.
figure out how to model that.
Yeah.
That is probably the biggest aha moment when I realized after quite a while. I mean, that was like maybe like 9 months into the design, where I started
Yeah.
making
Yeah.
other scenes. I'm like, oh wow, this is really flexible. And I guess
That's
finally
awesome.
the big aha moment was watching testers with the full hero builds, all the skills, play builds
Mm-hmm.
that I would have never imagined in really weird
Ah.
ways, and thus solving the combats, addressing them in really different ways than I would have ever done or our developers would have ever done, and solving the combats in ways, finding sort of ways around the puzzle that I hadn't intended and worked really well. That was again quite a teary-eyed moment. Like, wow, the
Yeah.
system
Yeah.
is quite sandboxy. It really works. It's not yeah, it's not rigid.
Yeah, you don't need that just one strategy to tackle this combat scene. It's like you could have different skill sets, different characters, and you can still figure it out in different ways. Very
And
cool.
those skill sets, the fun part is that when I change my build a lot and you change your build a lot, what our the agency that we have in the world is determined by those skills and the dice to a
Yeah.
degree. So now we have different ways of impacting the world and collaborating. We collaborate differently if we have different builds, and those builds are
Yeah.
pretty, not infinite, but there's a lot of them for each character.
Yeah.
So it's also it's not just me playing feeling different, but it compounds with the other very different builds. Well, the shaman, for example, can be a healer, or they can chuck lightning bolts at a big range, or they can be a little porcupine that defends
Yeah.
itself and kind of damages enemies that damaged it. Which those three play completely different with other
Yeah.
characters.
Yeah. That's so cool. And the shaman has a drum. Starts with a drum.
And there's a
That's cool.
drum and dances, a lot of dances.
Yeah, that's awesome. So another thing that I'm finding very impressive about Fateforge is it's gorgeous. Like the production is fantastic. Like I love the graphic design of even on the enemy tokens, like having the exclamation point to remind players that hey, this type of enemy has some kind of special rule or ability. And oh my gosh, I love the box that has the enemy tokens that shows you what they are inside the box. Like there's so many cool nice touches like artistically and graphic design wise. How did you guys kind of make those decisions?
In well, the for the most part, the majority of the development process, um, Heiko Gunther was doing all of that, and I
Ah,
love Heiko's work, graphic design wise, and usability, even product design wise. Heiko is fantastic, and he thinks a
awesome.
lot about this, the usability and the feel of the game. So now it's a little bit more has a little bit more what Heiko calls shishi, as in more flourish, more bit more fantasy visuals, which I eventually
Yes.
decided to put in towards the end of the process. But it's still very very clean because we wanted to communicate, and this is Heiko was fantastic at this. Wanted to communicate that the system is light and streamlined, and unlike a lot of other dungeon crawlers, which are quite, a bit fiddly and bit bitsy,
Yeah.
um, in the way it looks. So it's quite sparse, right? Like the enemy cards, the item cards. There isn't a lot of visual flourishes, which for some people might be not very fantasy-ish,
Yeah.
or more used to more illustrated cards. But those illustrated cards are also harder to parse. And
Mm.
because they have a lot of illustration and illustrated frames, have smaller text and so on. So we really put a lot of emphasis on usability. And the other important thing to mention is that Heiko was involved really early. I mean, Heiko was involved after that, initial terrible prototype I had, and was really patient and generous with his
Awesome.
time throughout this process. And so the design evolved with the game. And in terms of the product design, Heiko designed the initial layout of the box and how things would fit. Heiko also came up with the idea of the Tetris-shaped tiles that
Oh,
were
yeah.
initially just two shapes, so that they're easy to recognize. And for me, again, goes back to my aha moment of my pew pew. There's something about those shapes, and we played around with them quite a bit, which allows me to do a streetscape. And if I
Yeah.
combine them next to each other, an open field. It's that's actually a really brilliant idea to kind of, in an abstract way, make a thing look like what it is, not just on a book or a
Sure,
static map,
sure.
but in these combined shapes. And so that's the first thing I do. If I have a villa, I make a shape that feels like a villa layout.
Gotcha,
Um,
gotcha.
Finally, Mark Assa, one of the directors of Mighty Boards, got involved later in the process and added some of the more visual flourishes, and did all the tray design, also all the product design that you're seeing there, is is done by Mark. And he put sort of the final sort of product together. And Mark is just fantastic
Cool.
at the design of objects and boards and so on. He's the mind behind the product design of Excavation Earth, of Posthuman Saga, and
Very
Rebirth coming
nice.
up, and Our Society and so on. So that's where it came from. I did the art direction for the whole thing, and then Heiko did the graphic design and product design along with Mark.
Wow.
And of
Very,
course,
very cool.
big shout out to Studio Agat, who already had the visual style for the game.
Right.
So all the enemies and characters are designed by us. All the scenes in the app and in the rulebook, that's Studio Agat.
Oh, cool. Yeah, that makes sense.
And finally, the biggest, the thing which took longest and was most drawn out, were the tiles. We had a really hard time finding an artist that would do the tiles as we wanted them to. I personally do not like. I don't think there's any game whose tiles I like personally. I
Mm,
find them too boring. Like, here's the texture. Okay, it's the same texture. I wanted them
gotcha.
to be a lot more immersive, a lot
Y-
more cozy and lived in.
Yeah.
And Yusuf Artoon did the those tile designs, and then Max Kosek gave them. There was some pushback from a few loud Kickstarter backers that were making a fuss that the tiles were too flat, and we like them. They're good, and actually they were right. One
Fuck.
particular militant and aggressive backer was actually really right. They needed
Okay.
more coziness, more lighting, more depth. And Max Kosek, our graphic designer at Mighty Boards, did an insane job. And he also did the map, by the way,
Oh, wow. Nice.
which was much simpler before he got his hands on it. And Max is a graphic designer, not an illustrator. So
Wow.
this job is just honestly astounding. We did not expect that. And he had just joined Mighty Boards, by the way. That's the first thing he did for Mighty Boards. He's like, here, hello, new graphic
Wow.
designer. Here's an illustration of a complicated city. Go. And he knocked it out of the park 3 times over. Huh? I have to thank as well the artists on Fateforge. I mean, Shama Orcha, who's a senior artist, concept artist at CD Projekt. Tony Montin, another artist from CD Projekt. Yusuf was also at CD Projekt, all working on The Witcher. These are the people that drew those, illustrated the characters and the enemies and so on. So and the box art, there's a fair bit of firepower behind that look.
Big collaborative effort. Yeah. Fantastic. Fantastic. So you kind of touched on your original name, Fast Forward Dungeon. And then, so when and how did you come up with Fateforge Chronicles of Kaan? Was it just based on the RPG?
Yeah, so the agreement with Agat, this is a very ambitious project. This is just the first step in this collaboration. We have a 10-year plan with Studio Agat, which involves a video game of Chronicles of Kaan will be coming out from us. They've already done one narrative video game, and they'll be doing more. They just announced another and a solo TTRPG. We're going to be working on a lot of transmedia projects together. So the agreement is that Mighty Boards takes Kaan, a continent within the Ayana, the Fateforge world, and we'll create essentially what Studio Agat does is encyclopedias and bestiaries. So the world, the timeline is at zero, and there's no source books, right? Unless another medium like a book or a choose your own adventure type thing, or a solo TTRPG or a video game takes the timeline forward by zooming into one area and going at it in quite a bit of detail. So the base game is set in Eosaphir within Kaan. Clash of Immortals takes you around Kaan to introduce you to the rest of the region, which is very different from Eosaphir. Eosaphir is a bit of an upstart kingdom. And the next expansion, which I'm designing at the moment, takes us to the north, to Septentrion. So basically, this continent is where Chronicles of Kaan will be set in. All the expansions, and if the game has support enough, also digital expansions that will use the bits that you have to play more scenarios, they will all take place in Kaan. Eventually, if the game has positive response and spreads enough, further down the line, we will take another region and do another set of heroes, another long story somewhere else. So the name came from there. It's Fateforge. That's the brand, and a region, Kaan, and then Chronicles of is all the stuff, all the stories we will tell in various media within Kaan and within the system.
Cool. That makes sense. That's cool. When did you feel like the game was ready to kind of be called finished?
It's not. No, in the sense that we're still iterating on it. We released battle mode not too long ago, where you just do combats and no campaign. I don't know. It's a really, one of the challenging aspects of it is that it's such an ongoing process, and because we have another big thing with the app is that you can balance more as we go along. Today we had a big discussion about an aspect of the game that we're thinking of tweaking a little bit, and we can even add a particular rule in a particular player mode and implement it, and it's fine. So that is great, but also it's a blessing, a great blessing, and a massive curse, because I can't stop thinking about it, and I have to keep working on it. So it was very difficult to decide when it was done, and I had a hard time with figuring out when the balancing was enough in all player counts.
Yeah,
I think I'm gonna be honest. We tested it to death and we balanced it to death, but at one point, what decided when we're gonna keep, the length, the structure of it, I knew. I had the structure down. I knew how many combats there were going to be, roughly how many side quests. I'm super structural with my work, and that was done really early on. But how much testing it needs, when is the story edited down enough, and where are the main features down, that was hard. And it basically went to I had one player account super polished and super tested, and then the iterations on the rest, I guess, ended when the team just not just got burnt out, but when they could not cope with the fallout of the burnout. And there's a key
Mm.
people that just could not go on,
Yeah. Yeah.
myself included.
Yeah.
Crashed pretty hard towards the end of the game. We've been really, really pushing this for years. And ultimately, that's what decided, like, okay, we stop
This is
here,
we're good.
we take a
Yeah.
break, and then we balance more later. But it's designed in a certain way that we can change things in the app.
That's cool.
So there are 2 points where the game is done. One, when do we send it to the factory?
Mm-hmm.
That was when we were sure that all printed material, all the costs of things was down, so the progression was done. So basically, sorry for the long answer, we
It's
knew
okay.
that it was done when particular components of the game were tested enough. So we had to separate aspects of the game, make sure those were solid, and when they ticked all the boxes of the aspects relating to printing were done and tested and sorted, then they went off to print. And
Gotcha.
that delayed twice for 3 months because I wasn't happy with it. Then when the app was locked, was a bit of a different story. That's where the balancing was done. The next part came when is all the story text and all the text instructions are done so that they can be translated. Fateforge had a lot of localization partners from quite early on. So
Gotcha.
they were waiting for the files to come in for them to translate.
Mm.
And thus we had to lock that text and also the instructions that go with it because they had to be translated. So there you go.
Yeah.
And that's just that was the next step. And finally, the balancing of combats, the final polish on that was done when we collapsed. There you go.
Gotcha.
Sorry for the complex answer, but like none
No,
of
I
this
mean
was
it's
like any other
yeah.
game we've done.
Yeah. I mean, it's a complex game, and that's exactly why I created this show, is because I want to hear about what all goes into create certain games and share that with other people too, because it's a lot. It's a lot.
Hmm.
Well,
And
anyway,
ultimately,
Gordon. Yeah.
sorry,
No, go
I
ahead.
had
Go ahead.
to, I have to admit, like my developers, my two main developers on this project, Christian Paller and Harry Aportoglu, had to at some point just sit me down and go like, just it's great, it's done. I'm like, no, it's not.
Mm.
No, it's done. Stop. And after I don't know a couple of interventions, because I'm hard headed and it took a while, I had to sort of give up.
Yeah.
But it was
Yeah.
difficult to say this is done because like yeah, but in this branch, in that player account with these heroes, then that's
Yeah.
not tested enough, and so on. And so it was forced upon me,
Mm.
and I
Yeah.
thank them for it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Got your baby out into the world. So Gordon, you mentioned like you have such a strong like RPG background from your childhood and everything. And clearly you went through all of the effort with the team to create Fateforge Chronicles of Kaan. So, do you have any advice for someone who might be interested in designing a narrative driven, a cooperative kind of adventure game?
I think my main advice would go a little bit broader to talking about narrative games in general. Um, and the answer is going to be maybe a little bit biased and weird in the sense that I think that the first thing that a fledgling or somebody doing narrative board game design for the first time should read some game studies work on narrative. Why? Because game narrative is not straightforward. It's the most contentious aspect of game studies theory because there is a lack of agreement on what game narrative is. You'd also notice that in video games, if you go to GDC, the Game Developer Conference, this is one of the most frequent arguments and long-standing discussions and common topics you'll find over the years. There is a lack of understanding or agreement on what game narrative actually is because it's for a lot of people, we just assume it's kind of the thing that narrative is in the case for books or film, but it's not the case at all. So what are the unique aspects of game narrative? First, you want to understand that before trying to design narrative. Otherwise, you end up doing something that's kind of a book but a game, or kind
Gotcha.
of anyway. So I think that'll be the first step, and try to get a conceptual understanding of what kind of game narrative you want to make and what kind of game narrative there could be. On the sort of the most basic part of this framework is what I mentioned in passing in the interview, like scripted narrative, what is written into the game, like the block text that you follow in a branching path or whatever, and an emergent narrative that comes out of gameplay. When these two things are balanced well, you get, I think, those magic narrative moments. So a lot of it is quite conceptual, I think. And then the next step is to figure out where on this sort of continuum of scripted to emergent you want to go, and lean heavily into it. So if I'm going to do a scripted narrative game, why is this a game? I would urge the person to ask themselves, why is this game not a book, right? Like, or not a movie? What can a
Right.
game do with a narrative that cannot be done by other media, and like really lean into that? And I think there's so much space, so much design space that hasn't been explored with narrative. We've seen more and more narrative games come up, and it's one of the areas of the biggest areas of growth, I think, in the last 10 years, 5 even more. But there's still so much to explore, and it's so beautiful. Like how do
Yeah.
you represent the world? When you go to this theory, because theory is at pains at explaining these characteristics of narrative, it'll guide you. Like reading work, but like Mary Laura Ryan's fantastic set of books on and models on what makes up a narrative, and take each of these things, the world, the characters, the rules, and so on, and figuring out how much rules, how much attention do I want on this particular aspect of narrative,
Gotcha.
and then modeling that. So I think it reads a lot of conceptual thinking more than a lot of other types of game. And then finally, I'd say, once you decide on that, just put the mechanics that are needed to support narrative. If this is mainly a narrative game, then lean into that and use the mechanics to support it. If it's going to be a game which tells a story that you want to tell as a designer or a writer, then pull the mechanics away. Just have enough mechanics to animate the choices and sense of agency that you need in your world. While if it's an emergent story, then you want to have systems. You're going to have more systems because you need things to simulate this world, but have just enough to create these images in the player's mind. So I don't know if that's too conceptual, but I think the biggest challenge to narrative games is exactly these early conceptual phases.
Gotcha.
And I think that's why we see such a wide range of systems for narrative games that are very different from each other compared to other games, compared to like area control or whatever that have
Right,
more
right.
similar mechanics.
Cool. Gordon, thanks so much. It was like awesome to hear the backstory for how Fateforge Chronicles of Kaan was created. Like I said, it's a very impressive package that I've only dipped my toes into, but really impressive, and
Thank
so
you.
good job to you and the team who put this all together. So I know Clash of the Immortals is out, and you already touched on that you have more expansions hopefully coming down the pike with Fateforge, but is there anything else you're working on that you'd like to mention?
Yeah, I'm currently working on a two-player, like 45-minute thematic Euro game, where you play two board gods, creating a world to bring your weird creatures into being and have them
Cool.
survive over a number of ages. It wants to again speed up time a lot and have a lot of time passing, and it's kind of a
Yeah.
dominant species spliced with evolution and Cascadia, but
Cool.
streamlined.
Neat. That sounds super
I'm
cool.
working on a solo fantasy adventure, which is very very sandboxy. I'm trying to put in the minimal rules to create that emergent narrative that I just talked about. And there's something I've been working on for a while now, which I'm working on the back burner, which I'm super excited about, and that's a two-player skirmish game that uses
Ooh.
fantasy game that uses the Fateforge system. So a competitive,
Ooh.
a
Okay.
dice-based system, but where you have a particular champion or hero that has a retinue or even some units. It works for both, and you battle it out. But the main thing I'm focusing on right now is Fateforge, Chronicles of Kaan, Kin of the Wild, which is our upcoming expansion that will
Ooh.
would include a new story that goes up north in sort of the colder parts of the region, and feature companion creatures that players get
Oh.
to each have their own pet and
I
control.
love
And
that. Gordon, thanks again so much. Yeah, and I didn't mention it yet, but I definitely appreciate that you created a game of this style that can be played in a short period, because I definitely get intimidated by thinking about breaking out like Frosthaven and big games like that. It's like, oh, when am I going to have the time to do that? So I love that there's something that gives me that feel in a different way in a shorter time span. That's really cool. So thanks
Thanks.
again for joining me.
Thank you very much. This was really lovely.
Thank you all for tuning in to Cardboard Creations. Hopefully, it's been as inspiring and fascinating for you as it has been for me. And remember, the only way to get something done is to start doing it. Boom.